The Wuhan lab was actually built by the French. The French came in and set up this P4 lab at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. We advised against it because we said this is highly sensitive, dangerous technology. We might not want to be handing it over to the Chinese. The French, being the French, went ahead and did it anyway. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was in February of 2017, after which the French were shown the door, and no French scientists were ever allowed back in the lab. But the French are involved. The French are also involved because the head of the P4 lab, Dr. Shi Zhengli, whom we've talked about before at great length, Dr. Shi was at the Pasteur Institute in France, and that's where she learned about how to insert pieces of the AIDS virus into other viruses to make them more pathogenic, to make them more dangerous. So the French are involved. They don't want to talk about what happened in the lab. And the Americans are involved as well. Professor Ralph Barrick of the University of North Carolina was on the receiving end of major grants from the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease. This, of course, is Dr. Anthony Fauci's shop. He's a big proponent of gain-of-function research. He has been since at least 2011 when he published an article in the Washington Post advocating for it. And when this was stopped at Professor Barrick's lab, they moved the research to China. So Professor Barrick and some American virologists have been involved in the lab in past years. But this is what happened. As soon as this research, as soon as this virus began to show dangerous properties, the virus was more infectious, the virus was more dangerous. Immediately, the People's Liberation Army bioweapons people got involved. And I can tell you as a China expert exactly why that happened. It happened because everything in China is dual-use technology. Everything in China follows the rule of let the civilians support the military. So as soon as this civilian vaccine project at the Wuhan Institute of Virology showed promise, the military moved in and said, oh, this has military potential. And then who did you have come on the scene? You had people like General Chun Wei, the head of the PLA's bioweapons program. You had other people who were involved in the PLA's bioweapons program going into the lab and working with Dr. Shi, who basically lost control of her own project. Now, there's only one difference. There's only one place where Dr. Trito and Dr. Yen disagree. Dr. Trito, for his part, cannot believe that the China virus was deliberately released from the P4 lab. And I think he cannot believe it because he is a Westerner. He's an Italian. He's a product of Western civilization. And it is simply beyond the comprehension of anybody who comes from that cultural milieu to credit the idea that a government would deliberately, a political party, a terrorist organization like the CCP would deliberately release a virus on its own people so that it could spread throughout the world. I, on the other hand, as a China expert who knows that what the Chinese Communist Party is capable of, think it is not beyond the realm of possibility that it was deliberately leaked out of the lab. Now, there is another possibility that a disgruntled employee, somebody angry at themselves and the world, took it out of the lab and spread it throughout the public. But I think that Dr. Trito's account, 272 detailed pages, dovetails perfectly with Dr. Yen's account. And I think we have the goods now on the Chinese Communist Party's People's Liberation Army developed bioweapon that is now killing people around the world. And, you know, you say it all the time on your show, and you're absolutely correct. China lies, and people continue to die.
Dr. Mosher, let's go back. I want to unpack. I want to unpack some of this. Second, I want to talk about the French and actually the building the lab. The lab came out of a good and healthy process. It was about SARS and about how you focus on SARS and then MERS that came out of China in the early 2000s. And so they made the argument that they actually needed a P4 lab. It was very controversial at the time. The United States didn't support it, but wasn't part of the deal in the French actually building it that the French were supposed to take some sort of supervisory role. There was no question that the Dr. Batwoman and others around the Chinese program were not qualified to do the type of experimentation they were talking about. There was actually going to be some sort of overall supervision by the French.
Absolutely. The joint research protocol that was signed by the French and the Chinese governments stated that the Wuhan Institute of Virology would build a residential complex, and that after the opening of the lab, there would be 50, that is 50, French researchers, scientists at the P4 lab at the Wuhan Institute of Virology in Wuhan, China, to oversee the research with their Chinese colleagues. So there was supposed to be supervision and oversight and control to make sure this lab didn't do the things that it turned out to have done over the last few years. But what happened after the French premier cut the ribbon in February of 2017, officially opening up the lab? All the French were shown the door, Steve. Not a single French researcher was ever allowed to move into the residential complex and take up residence there and work in the lab along with Dr. Scher, because I think by that time, the People's Liberation Army had gotten involved and they had decided, we now have a great research lab, top of the line research lab that we can use to research bioweapons. And you know the rest of the story from there. But this is also a familiar story. The Chinese Communist Party signs an agreement, and as soon as it gets what it wants, whether it's technology, whether it's other kinds of assistance, financial assistance, it tears up the agreement, it walks away, and it does precisely what it wants. This is a Communist Party that operates by deceit and deception every step of the way. I think that the French should have seen this coming.
Regardless of what you think, like General Robert Spalding or Miles Guo or Stephen Mosher, that the CCP, consciously let this thing out, even if you're in the camp that, hey, inadvertently somehow it got out of the lab, what we know is that they were directly responsible. There's a chain of title of these experiments in this virus, which is not in nature. This virus, which is not found in nature, they're directly responsible back to the highest levels of Beijing. General Secretary Xi, Wang Xishan, and the rest of his henchmen are directly responsible to the world. We need to stop playing games. This book has to be analyzed. The doctor that wrote it has to be interviewed. And here's the important point. Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, said, hey, WHO's, gone over there and had a meeting, went to Beijing, talking about what they're going to see and what they're not going to see. The book reinforces what Dr. Yan says. They've never given us the original genome sequence of what this virus was. The reason they wanted to hide what went on. They should get 72 hours. 72 hours to turn over everything. Every email, every text message, every report, every scientist, every lab technician, complete inspection of the labs by an international consortium led by the top scientists in the world from Europe, the United States, India, Japan, across the world. Africa, Latin America, the top virologists in the world should come together in Hong Kong, should come together in 72 hours and get to the bottom of this. It is outrageous that we've let this dictatorship lie to people's face and try to spin it that they're the saviors of the world because they'll give you PPE. Their collaborators and appeasers are going to be held accountable. They're not going to be able to run away from the truth. I'm going to quote Mao Zedong, from facts come truth. Okay? The facts are in the Wuhan lab. And those facts are going to show the truth. And the truth is the Chinese Communist Party and their biological weapons program, which they're not supposed to have because they signed the treaty in 1984. We know they were lying because of when they came into the WTO, they had to admit they had a program going, right? When they got this lab, one of the parts of the lab, they had to admit they had some experiments going. So they've consistently lied over 30 or 40 years. And here's what they see. They see biological and chemical weapons as a poor man's nuclear weapon. They don't need a massive nuclear program. And right now, they're in business with their partners in Pakistan. They're building a P3 lab there. They're talking to Iran about building a lab there. The Middle East is going to explode with these type of labs. And in these labs, in the Middle East, just like in China, only bad things happen. They weren't there. The doctors at first were there for the betterment of mankind, there to help solve in case another SARS broke out. We saw what happened. They weaponized the lab. They weaponized the research. They got into this concept called gain of function. It's a term we brought up. Dr. Mosher, can you explain to the audience once again gain of function and the good reasons people try to do it, but the difficulty with it, and what do you say these things are built in labs that are man-made?
In development, Steve, the reverse genetics, it's called, is used to create viral strains that have reduced pathogenicity, but to which the immune system responds by creating antibodies against the virus. That's a good use of reverse genetics. But reverse genetics can also be used to create viral strains that are increasingly dangerous, increasingly lethal, and increasingly infectious. And that's what Dr. Shizhong Li in her P4 lab at the Wuhan Institute of Virology did. She was encouraged and working with PLA bioweapons experts and began to focus her research on this. And that's not just me talking, that's also Dr. Yen, that's also Professor Trito, of course, world-renowned scientist who now has written a book laying out exactly how this was done. Again, Dr. Shi from the P4 lab in Wuhan first solicited help from the French government, which built the P4 lab, and from the French government's Pasteur Institute, which showed her how to manipulate HIV genomes. The gene insertion method she used is called reverse genetic system 2. Using this method, she inserted an HIV segment into a coronavirus discovered in horseshoe bats to make it more infectious and lethal. That was 10 years ago. And then, of course, we moved to the United States, to the University of North Carolina, where in a lab at that university, which was on the receiving end of major grants from Dr. Fauci, they did gain-of-function research. Gain-of-function. What kind of functions are they making coronaviruses gain? They're making them more infectious and more lethal. In other words, they're creating superbugs in the lab. Now, the idea that they would create superbugs in the lab boggles the mind. Why would you ever create a dangerous, potentially lethal coronavirus in the lab that might escape from the lab? Well, the idea was we're going to create superbugs in the lab so that we can create a vaccine against it, so that we can develop therapies against it. So when the real superbug comes on the scene, we'll be ready for it. Well, that's all fun and games until you hand over the technology to the Chinese Communist Party. It gets its PLA bioweapons people in charge, and they're doing gain-of-function research to make a coronavirus that's more lethal and infectious than anything found in nature, not to develop a vaccine, not to develop therapies, but to release it on the world and cripple the world's economy, killing hundreds of thousands of people in the process. Now, that's what happened in China. That's what's happening to us right now. And, you brought up the question of why China has refused to provide the complete genome of the China virus to the World Health Organization, to the United States, or anywhere else. Dr. Trito, remember, our Italian scientist, world-renowned scientist, explains this. He said, quote, if the Chinese provided the matrix virus, that is the original virus, the source virus that they created, it would have meant admitting that SARS-CoV-2, the China virus, was created in a laboratory. In fact, he went on to say the incomplete genome made available by China lacks some inserts of AIDS amino acids, which itself is a smoking gun. So if you look at the incomplete genome of the China virus that has been provided by China, you can see that there are pieces missing that constitute a smoking gun. Now, the key question, of course, for those of us who are living through a pandemic concerns the development of a vaccine. Professor Trito on this point is not optimistic. He says, given the many mutations of the China virus, it's unlikely a single vaccine that blocks the virus will be found. Quote, at the moment, 11 different strains have been identified of the China virus. The A2A genetic line developed in Europe, the B1 genetic line, which took root in North America, are more contagious than the original strain originating in Wuhan. I therefore believe, Dr. Trito says, At most, a vaccine can be found effective on 4 or 5 strains and able to cover 75% of the world's population. In other words, Steve, by withholding from the world the original genetic code of the China virus that it created in order to hide its complicity, the Chinese Communist Party is ensuring that no completely effective vaccine will ever be developed by the West. In other words, China continues to lie and people continue to die. This is yet one more nail in the coffin of the Chinese Communist Party. We need to put this political organization out of existence forever.
Dr. Mosher, if you were in the Oval Office today, what are the 2 or 3 things you would tell the President of the United States he has to do in confronting the Chinese Communist Party about this virus?
Well, I think we have to put the Chinese Communist Party on notice that they have a deadline, 72 hours, 96 hours. I don't care what it is. We need a deadline for them to turn over all of the records, the complete genome of the China virus, and admit to the world what they've done. Failing that, we should think about extending diplomatic recognition to Taiwan, breaking ties with the Chinese Communist Party-controlled People's Republic of China. We know what's going on in Xinjiang, in Tibet, in Outer Mongolia. We know what's going on in Hong Kong now. We know that they're developing possible invasion plans in the South China Sea vis-a-vis Taiwan or Japan. The time to the real China virus, of course, is the Chinese Communist Party itself. That's what we need to get to in order to solve the.
Yesterday, we had Dr. Ryan of the World Health Organization come out and say, almost as a kind of preemptive warning to the world, that, hey, people, we may never get to the bottom of this. We may never find out where this is. And again, the World Health Organization still has not resolved their agreement with the Chinese Communist Party as to how they're actually going to investigate this virus. But Dr. Yan, for our audience, I really want you to talk about, I know that you believe that this virus was released on purpose by the CCP. And we talked about this over the weekend, and you had a really poignant way of describing why you thought this was the case. And it was because you looked back at Chinese history and you realized that they'd done multiple things like this in the past. And I wish you could kind of talk about that and explain to you your awakening.
And as I said, from the beginning, the China government tried to cover up all these things and mislead the information to the animals in the seafood market, and also try to postpone the diagnosis, try to delay the submission of the genome sequence to the world, and even later gave the wrong one and keep telling there is no human-to-human transmission. So image, if this is something come from nature and the government has no responsibility for that, why do they recruit such big force to stop people to understand what happened? Something come from nature is not the fault for the government, right? Even if people eat animals, we are not a single country that people eat some animals, right? And also back to their alternative choice, if this is an accident, come from some lab in China, then why don't our government, when they know it happened in even December or even early last year, why don't they try to stop it? From the early beginning, even this is a leakage, you can stop it. Right, you diagnose all the people, you check them, check their close contact, and find out where it comes from. Even for China government, if they don't want to admit this is a leakage at that time, they still can punish some people who should be responsible for that in the institute. No point to recruit WHO, recruit all the deep state people they had connected before in the world, in scientific world, and in even political world now, to get together to tell people something which is a lie. Now we know there are so many lies, right? They don't need to hide this kind of truth if this is either natural origins or if it's a leakage.
No, I wanted, you were talking to me over the weekend and we were saying, I sort of took the position of Dr. Mosher. I said, I cannot understand how the Communist Party would do something like this on purpose. And one of the things that you told me was, your eyes started to open when you really were getting threatened by your colleagues at the lab in Hong Kong by just asking questions. Your boss told you hey, you don't want to be disappeared. And you sort of implied to me that you don't think that there's any evil that they're not capable of. And when you look at their history, that should be proof to anybody that this is something that they are capable of and should not be discounted.
Yes, exactly. I mean, this will be a long story because it involved all the 70 years history in our in China, and even extend to the 100 years history to Chinese Communist Party. And this, I cannot explain all the things in just one interview. But what I can tell people is we cannot understand, even I cannot understand why they behave like that, because we are human. We are too kind to understand this kind of evil things. But if you stay in China for years, you stay in mainland China, or you now come to Hong Kong, you will understand these things are far beyond their imagination. They can do whatever they want because this is a government, this is a regime. They have no other independent surveillance. No other force can control them. They own 1.4 billion Chinese people and now extend even to the world and use their money, use their power to control them, even now control to U.S. You know what I mean, right? We can see what happened in scientific field and in the big also big high level the officers. And for example, why do they stop HCQ, stop hydroxychloroquine application in the emergency use, right? And also, back to our Chinese history. For example, we know from 1959 to 1961, 3 years, we have something called natural disaster, which is a big starvation and lead to at least 30 million Chinese people dead. I still don't think we can see the real data back to that time. But what I can say is if you ask the Chinese people who stay in that period in China, all of them can tell you they know someone or their relatives or even the very close people in their family died of this kind of starvation. Our government don't give food to people. We still cannot understand why it happened. But even in my family, my grandpa's father died of that. And we have some relative or other known people died of this. We are in a big city in China. Still, we suffer like that. We cannot understand. Our government never admits the reason. So if you think people should understand the motive of the Chinese Communist Party and then to admit, this is the purposely to release this virus, then I think we still need to take a long time because most of people in the world are too nice.
Dr. Yan?
Dr. Yan, you said this when we first met you months and months ago, and then when you first came public, that you don't think there will ever be a vaccine for this. Dr. Trudeau said, hey, at most, it's going to be a vaccine that maybe solves 3 or 4 of these. Where do you think we stand until the CCP releases the original genome sequence? Do you think we'll ever get a vaccine?
I don't think so. So let me stress this problem. So first, you should understand that vaccine is not just a magic term that you say, we have vaccine so we can get all the problem disappeared. No, it's not like that. Vaccine is a big issue that you have to fully study the pathogen and then understand the weakness and also understand how it reacts to human bodies and target this kind of result, you can develop some vaccine to overcome the pathogen. Now, first we can say we have a high mutant new coronavirus now. So this virus spread all over the world, and it's very difficult for us now to understand how many serotypes there are and how long they can induce the different type of antibodies, and these antibodies last for how long in humans' bodies, and whether these antibodies are all neutralizing the virus or just some antibody who does just work as partially protection or even no help for human bodies. We don't know all these answers. And also the other thing is back to the early stage of this outbreak from December to January to later, China government, we have a lot of patients, right? Thousands, but they first hide the numbers of cases, and also they don't provide the genome sequence to the world. So that means we have some chance at that time to study this virus fully, even before it go to the other countries like US for the big outbreak. But this critical information was hidden by Chinese government. They even asked people to destroy those viral samples. And I work in Hong Kong. The Chinese government even don't want to provide those samples for us to do the analyze. So basically, although they use our institute, but they still worry that the sample will come out, maybe like me, go to US to let people know what they have been done. And also the other thing is, very important thing is they never do only one strain of virus. So it makes there are many virus strains in that stock, and they purposely release some. Why cannot they release the others? And how could you get a vaccine to overcome such problem?
Jack, I know you got a question to wrap this up.
Very quickly, guys.
Dr. John, I wanted to just get your answer on this real quick. We talked over the weekend, and really some of the things you touched me, and I asked you about, do you feel safe in America? And you answered something to the effect that none of us are going to be safe unless we defeat the CCP. Could you just elaborate on that real quick?
30 seconds, Dr. John.
No one is safe in any of the place in the world like we faced to this outbreak, right? And who did to this outbreak? Chinese Communist Party. And if they still stay there, how could people trust it? How could people let it stay there and feel we are safe just because we are not in mainland China or not in Hong Kong? Again, this is still common sense. You cannot trust them, so you cannot feel safe because they want to control you.